Murder on Tyneside. Chapter 1. Agnes Lockwood pulled up her collar. She realized she should have worn her scarf, but with the sun beaming through the window of her hotel room, she had thought it wouldn't be necessary. It felt good to be back on Tyneside at last. A number of years had passed since she'd last been here. Coming back to visit the place of her birth was something she had wanted to do for a long time. Yet, somehow, there had never been time. Even from the age of 12, when her family left the area, her life had run in the fast lane. Until now, some 40 years later, there had never been time to slow down and reflect on the past. It all began when her father had been offered an important diplomatic post in France, which resulted in her family making the move away from Tyneside. On their return, her father was offered a job based in London. Therefore, it was impractical for them to live too far from his place of work. Looking back, it seemed strange they had never found time to visit Tyneside. But now, having finally made the decision to visit the Northeast, Agnes had chosen to stay in a hotel on the quayside, once the very heart of Tyneside. Agnes moved across the pavement to the edge of the quay and looked down at the River Tyne. It was certainly much cleaner than she remembered. When she was last here, it had seemed more like a mud bath than an imposing river flowing through the city to the North Sea. Back then, it was said you only had to jump into the Tyne and you would die through the sheer pollution in the water. Still gazing down at the river, it occurred to her there must have been accidents back then, where men died because they slipped and fell into the murky water. Some may have even taken their own lives by throwing themselves into the river because they had found life too hard to bear. But worse still, how many might have been brutally murdered, their bodies thrown into the water, never to be seen again? She shuddered at the thought. Thankfully, those days were over. Glancing back along the quayside, she realized it wasn't just the river that was clean. The whole place had changed. The heavy industry of Tyneside had long disappeared, making way for cafes, restaurants, and other more genteel activities. Even though Agnes hadn't been in the city when the changes were taking place, she had read about what was happening. Yet she still hadn't been prepared for it to be quite so fashionable. She sighed as she turned away from the river and leaned back against the railings. The past was gone. There was no point her dwelling on it. Like the people who still lived here, she needed to change with the times, to move on. But move on where? What did the future hold for a widow of a certain age? She scolded herself for having such negative thoughts. First of all, she needed to pull herself together and stop dreaming about the past. Life had been good to her. Jim Lockwood had been a wonderful husband and a devoted father. A smile broke across her lips as she thought about her boys. They were men now, married and living on the other side of the world. Yet to her, they would always be her boys. Though there had been a number of years before Jim was due to retire, they had made plans to visit their sons more often when that day came. What would there be to stop them? They would have both the time and the money. Jim had held down a good job with the Foreign Office and had saved a great deal of money over the years to make sure they had a comfortable retirement. But then, all too soon, an aggressive form of cancer had taken Jim from her, and her world had fallen apart. She sniffed and blinked back, the tears forming in her eyes. It just wasn't fair. Her boys had wanted her to sell up and move out there with them when their father had died, and, for a short while, she had been sorely tempted. Yet she had decided against the idea, firmly telling them they had their own lives to lead. Pulling herself together, she glanced at her watch. Very soon she would need to return to her hotel and change for dinner. She looked back towards where her hotel was situated and was surprised to find that she hadn't actually walked very far. Perhaps she had time to continue onto the foot of the Tyne Bridge before turning back. Tomorrow it could be raining, and she didn't relish the idea of stomping along here in the rain. If that were the case, she would prefer to take a trip into the town center and do some shopping. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Back at the hotel, Agnes took a shower before deciding what to wear for the evening. She had brought far too many clothes. In the end, she chose a deep blue dress with matching shoes and bag. Being tall and slim, finding clothes had never been a problem for her. Jim always used to tell her she looked good in whatever she chose, and he was proud at having her by his side. She pulled on her dress and checked in the mirror as she smoothed it down. But then she frowned. Were a few gray hairs beginning to show? Moving nearer to the mirror, she took a closer look, hoping she was mistaken. However, it was no mistake. Her auburn hair was starting to change color, and it wasn't a color she favored. She sighed as she turned away from the mirror. Had they appeared overnight? They weren't there yesterday. She was going to have to visit the hairdresser when she got back home. She was just about to go down to dinner when she heard raised voices outside her door. She sat down on the bed, deciding to wait a few minutes until the people had moved on before venturing out into the corridor. They might be embarrassed if she suddenly appeared in the middle of what sounded like a row. However, the voices grew louder, and though she didn't mean to pry, she couldn't help hearing most of what was being said. It seemed that the lady had lost a necklace, or more to the point, she believed it had been stolen from her room while she was out shopping that afternoon. The gentleman with her didn't agree. He was trying to calm her down, saying that it couldn't possibly have been stolen. She must have put it down somewhere and forgotten where. "You're always doing that, my dear," the man told her. He spoke slowly, obviously trying to soothe the woman. "Give it some thought while we have dinner. You'll soon remember where you put it." However, the lady wasn't in the mood to be pacified. "I distinctly remember putting it in the top drawer of the dressing table before we left," she insisted. "Yet when I went to put it on this evening, it was missing. Don't you realize that? The necklace was the one you gave me for our wedding anniversary. It must have cost you the earth." There was a pause, and for one brief moment, Agnes thought they had gone. She was about to open her door when she was suddenly startled by a loud screech from the woman outside. "Oh my goodness, George, don't you realize? Someone must have been in our room while we were out." Her voice became hysterical. "I could have walked in and found some intruder going through our things. I could have been murdered. Call the police right now." "Calm down, Angela. There is no need to call the police. No one came into our room," George began. But with the thought of an intruder scouring through her personal belongings, Angela was not about to be silenced. "How the hell would you know?" she yelled. "You weren't even there. You stayed downstairs in the bar with your so-called business partners." There was a slight pause. "I want to see the manager now. Are you coming with me, or are you going to sit back and leave everything to me as usual?" The voices grew faint as the man and woman hurried off down the corridor. Agnes took the room key out of her bag and stared down at it. It wasn't an old-fashioned conventional key. It looked more like a credit card, which you placed into a slot on the door. When withdrawn, a green light flashed to tell you the door was unlocked. She recalled the first time she had used this type of key. She and Jim had been staying in a hotel in Las Vegas. He had been amused at her attempts to unlock the door to their room. "It's simple," he'd said. "Slide the card into the slot, remove it, and open the door." Yet when she tried, a red light appeared and the door had refused to open. Only when Jim explained she was being too hasty in removing the card and needed to slow down was she able to gain access to the room. Now she was fine with this newfangled idea and thought it was probably a lot safer than a standard lock. They could be picked by some unscrupulous guest staying at a hotel. She looked towards the door and screwed up her eyes as she gathered her thoughts together. So, if there was no lock to pick, how could someone have managed to get into the woman's hotel room without one of these magic key cards? It wasn't possible, unless one of the staff, having seen the lady wearing the necklace sometime during the day, had decided that it might be worth stealing. Some members of staff had access to what was called a master key card, which opened all the doors to the guest rooms. These were only meant to be used by domestic staff when they serviced the rooms. Was it possible they were kept in a place where they could be accessed by other staff? Agnes shook her head. For goodness sake, she needed to get a grip. Jim had often said she had read far too many Agatha Christie novels and was always trying to solve a crime when there was no crime to solve. Perhaps George was right. This Angela, whoever she was, might be the sort of woman who put things down and then forgot about them. He should know. He was probably her husband. If not, then he must know her well enough for them to be sharing a room. Agnes thrust her key back into her bag and hurried down to dinner. Murder on Tyneside. Chapter 2. The smell of food wafting from the kitchen as Agnes entered the dining room made her realize how hungry she was. She enjoyed her meal so much it was only now, as she ordered coffee and a liqueur, that she really noticed the other people in the dining room. Everyone looked smartly turned out. No one was wearing jeans. But then, being fairly new on the scene, the hotel was rather upmarket. There were a few of the diners wearing more elaborate outfits. Agnes assumed they were going somewhere else after dinner. She knew there were a number of theaters and concert halls in the city. Though she wasn't the only person sitting at a table set for one, she noted that most of the tables had at least 2 diners. There were even a few tables with 6 or more people enjoying dinner together. She suddenly felt conspicuous at being alone. She heaved a sigh. Jim had been gone for almost a year. She should be getting used to it by now. And she was normally. But there were times when she felt it would be nice to have someone with whom to have dinner now and then, or even the occasional drink. It was while she was sipping her coffee that she became aware of loud voices coming from somewhere in the corridors outside the dining room. Some of the guests sitting nearest to the door leaned back and forth, trying to see out into the reception area. But judging from the shaking of heads, Agnes guessed they couldn't see who was doing all the talking. As the voices grew louder, Agnes realized that they were the same people she had heard in the corridor outside her room. Until now, she had completely forgotten about the incident. I'm telling you that you have a thief on your staff. I suggest you start searching their belongings before someone leaves the building with my necklace. There was no mistaking Angela's high-pitched voice. Madam, I can assure you that we will speak to all the members of our staff. But I am certain no one working at this hotel stole your necklace. Agnes didn't recognize the man's voice, but she guessed he must be the manager. He sounded as though he was trying to stay calm, yet his tone told her he was becoming very exasperated with this particular guest. Don't give me all that rubbish. I want the police informed this minute. Bye. Now Angela was in full flow. Nothing was going to stop her from having her say. I refuse to be fobbed off any longer. The necklace was a surprise gift from my husband. Tell him, George. My dear, George didn't get any further as his wife continued her rant. If you don't get on the phone right now, I will speak to your head office. Very well, I will call the police, the manager said. Can we please go into my office while we sort this out? I have no wish to continue this discussion in the hotel reception. Yes, a good idea, Mr. Jenkins. Thank you. Come along, my dear. The manager's office is just across the hall. It will be more private. We can talk about it there. I'm sure we don't need to involve the police. George sounded as though he would like to be 1,000 miles away. Very well. We shall go to your office, Mr. Jenkins. Angela retorted. But be aware, I have far from finished this conversation. And, George, what are you talking about? Of course the police must be called. There were a few more words spoken, and then there was silence in reception. Agnes glanced around the dining room as everyone resumed their own conversations. It had gone very quiet during the row in the reception area. It seemed she hadn't been the only one eavesdropping. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. After dinner, Agnes went through to the drawing room. She hadn't wanted to go straight back to her room where she would be on her own. At least being here, she was among lively people, and even if she wasn't part of their group, their enthusiasm added a spark of life to her otherwise quiet world. Agnes gazed around the room, taking in her surroundings. The hotel had been newly built during the renovation of the quayside. At first she thought that perhaps it might have been better if they had kept the facade of whatever had stood here previously and added a new interior. Some of the cafes and restaurants seemed to have done that, but maybe that wouldn't have worked in this case. She recalled that the courthouse, a short distance from the hotel, was also a brand new building. Everything about the hotel was modern, including this room. The sofas were comfortable, the walls were decorated with expensive draperies, and to top it all, there were large ornate mirrors reflecting different aspects of the room. But then, she noticed a couple of the mirrors were placed at such an angle areas of the reception and the entrance to the hotel could be seen from where she was sitting. How creepy is that? She thought. If we sitting in here can see who is entering the hotel, does that mean that anyone standing at the entrance can peer inside and see people sitting in here? Agnes deliberated as to whether to change her seat, but decided to stay where she was. Other guests in the drawing room might think she was crazy if she suddenly started moving from one sofa to another. Instead, she turned away from the mirror and began to think about what she might do the following day. A trip to the shopping center seemed a good idea. She simply adored shopping, but she also wanted to visit the places of her childhood in the hope she would meet someone from her past, though she did wonder if she would recognize anyone. Many years had passed since she had lived here. People changed as they grew older. For goodness sake, even she had changed over the years. She looked nothing like she did on her old school photos. She glanced around at the people in the room. There could be people here, whom she had met all those years ago, but couldn't recognize now. What was she doing here? Why was she trying to rake up her past? There wasn't anything she could identify herself with anymore. It had seemed such a good idea at the time, but now she realized it was a big mistake for more reasons than one. She was just about to go back to her room when she heard more raised voices in reception. It seemed the police had arrived. At least Angela would be happy now, though for everyone else it could mean the hotel would be in turmoil while guests and their rooms were searched. Instead of being upset at such disorder, Agnes hid a smile. It would be different from the usual mundane ritual she was becoming used to. It would be exciting to be considered a suspect in a police inquiry. Of all the wonderful, crazy things she and her husband had done in the past, they had never been under suspicion of theft and had their rooms searched. She clapped her hands together. This was a first. How Jim would have loved it. Perhaps things were beginning to look up. Murder on Tyneside. Chapter 3. By now Agnes had joined the crowd gathering in the reception. They were told that once the police questioned all the staff who was still on duty, they would need to speak to the guests. Meanwhile, no one could leave the hotel. The manager was horrified at the thought. He said he could not allow it, insisting no one could enter any of the hotel rooms without a key card. It is absolutely impossible. Agnes felt a little sorry for him. This was certainly not good news for the hotel. She looked at the people standing near the manager, wondering whether Angela was one of them. Her eyes rested on a woman who seemed to be bursting to say something. Surely that had to be Angela. She was about 45 or thereabouts. It was hard to tell as her face was layered with makeup. She was wearing a closely fitted, dark red dress. But at the moment, Agnes's eyes were fixed on her necklace. It looked very expensive. If the one she'd had stolen was similar, it was little wonder she was making such a fuss. Agnes was proved to be right when the woman finally got the chance to butt in. That's rubbish, Angela said, wagging her finger at him. We read about people hacking into computers all the time. I'm sure such a scoundrel could devise a master key card to every hotel room as simple as that. She snapped her fingers. I absolutely insist that every room be thoroughly searched right now. She was so enraged her face had almost turned as red as her dress, and her long, dangling earrings shook violently as she spoke. Someone here has stolen my valuable necklace given to me by my lovely husband. I want it found and the thief prosecuted. Agnes looked at the men standing nearby, wondering which one was the lovely George. He hadn't said a word during the whole episode in reception. However, for some reason after Angela's last remark, one of the men opened his mouth to say something, but he didn't get the chance as Angela held up her hand to interrupt him. George, I am dealing with this. Leave it to me. Without another word, George pushed his way through the crowd and headed towards the bar. Agnes watched him disappear into the bar. She thought he looked relieved to be out of the spotlight. Summing him up, she thought he appeared to be slightly older than his wife, quite tall and rather slimly built. Probably a very attractive man in his youth, but at the moment he looked as though he was carrying the world on his shoulders. Agnes understood how upset Angela must be at having a gift from her husband stolen while they were out enjoying themselves. However, the woman did seem to be a bit of a dragon where he was concerned. Did she really have to act so dominant? She placed her hand over her mouth to suppress a giggle. Dominant? Where did that come from? But somehow it seemed to fit nicely with Angela's personality. It was possible George enjoyed his wife being dominant in the boudoir. He did look like the tall, silent type. Maybe Angela just carried it a little too far when they were in the real world. I am so terribly sorry for the inconvenience. The voice of Mr. Jenkins interrupted Agnes's thoughts. He had disappeared into his office for a few minutes, but now he was back trying to soothe the throng of guests who had gathered to see what all the fuss was about. He took out his handkerchief and mopped his forehead. I have spoken with the police superintendent, and it seems that I have little choice but to allow a complete search of all the rooms at the hotel. However, he held up his hand when the people standing in front of him began to protest. However, he repeated, I insisted that a senior police officer is placed in charge of the investigation, someone who will respect the privacy of our guests. I am pleased to say the superintendent has agreed. He paused. Meanwhile, I have been asked to inform you that no one will be allowed to leave the hotel until the search has been made. but I am assured it will be carried out as soon as possible. By now, the reception area was buzzing with activity. Agnes looked around at her fellow guests. There was some making a fuss, most especially the ones she had previously thought might be spending the evening at a concert. Others were calling friends and relatives on their mobile phones to pass on the news of them being held inside the hotel. "No, June, we're not being held at gunpoint," Agnes heard one woman yell down her phone. But the way the woman went on to describe the scene, they might well have been. However, most were making their way to the bar. To them, it seemed a stiff drink was called for. "Does that mean we won't be able to check out this evening?" said a man to one of the police officers. "Yes, it does," replied the officer. "Is that a problem for you?" he added, narrowing his eyes. Could this man be the culprit anxious to get out of the hotel? "Heck, no," said the man, his American accent showing through. "We're on our honeymoon and would love an extra night here." "That's great. I mean, officer." Agnes left the reception area and went back into the drawing room. Despite her previous thoughts on the strategically placed mirrors, she chose a sofa where she could see most of what was going on outside in reception. For a while it was quite calm. A few people checked in at the desk. Most of the new guests had already arrived earlier in the day. But she noticed that after being given the key card to their room, they were shown across to the drawing room where complimentary drinks were offered for the inconvenience. However, the calmness was about to be broken as Mr. Jenkins, accompanied by another man, appeared from his office. They both walked across to the reception desk, where Mr. Jenkins spoke to one of the staff on duty. She nodded and rang the small bell on the desk. Some of the people sitting in the bar and the drawing room went out to see what was going on. "Chief Inspector Johnson would like to speak to you all," called out the manager once he had their attention. "I'm sure the chief inspector won't detain you any longer than necessary." He nodded towards the detective, indicating he could begin his inquiry. "I understand how inconvenient this must be to everyone staying at the hotel. However, it seems that one of the guests has had a rather valuable necklace stolen," and the chief inspector was interrupted. "She's simply mislaid it." The voice came from the back of the reception area. "She does this sort of thing all the time?" Agnes recognized George's voice, even though his words were very slurred. Obviously, he'd had too much to drink. "Will you stop saying that?" "I have not mislaid my necklace," Angela hissed. "It has been stolen." She paused when she realized all eyes were now pinned on her. "I'm sorry, Inspector. Do please carry on." "Chief Inspector," he corrected her before continuing. "As I was saying, we need to search each guest and also their rooms before anyone is allowed to leave the hotel. We'll begin with those guests who need to check out this evening." He paused when one of the officers whispered something in his ear. "I have been reminded that some people are going to the concert being held in the Sage this evening. Therefore, we will try to check your rooms first." He nodded towards his sergeant before continuing. "I'm sure we can do this in an orderly manner and get it over with as quickly as possible. My sergeant will take the names of all those who need to leave the hotel this evening for whatever reason." The moment the chief inspector stopped speaking, everyone started talking. Agnes stood there wondering what to do next. Should she go into the drawing room and wait until she was called? She was booked into the hotel for another 5 days and hadn't any plans for the evening, which meant there was no rush for her or her room to be searched right away. She glanced across at the chief inspector. He looked rather tired. Perhaps he had just been about to go off duty when this call came through to his office. Or was it simply because he saw this as another case where some overrich woman had hidden her necklace in a safe place in her room, but then forgot where she had put it? Agnes couldn't help thinking Chief Inspector Johnson was a rather attractive man, despite the lines of tiredness etched on his face. Placing her head on one side, she peered at him inquisitively and made a guess that he was about her age. He was rather tall, clean-shaven, and his dark hair was showing a hint of gray at the sides, something she thought made him look rather distinguished. He was wearing a dark gray suit, white shirt, and a dark gray tie. She noted that his shoes were so polished, he would be able to see his face in them should he ever be caught without a mirror. But then she realized that all police detectives wore suits these days. It was their badge of office, so to speak. She guessed that the character in the TV show Morse probably had a lot to do with that. But this particular detective suit looked a cut above regular suits. Could it be handmade? She wondered whether the wages of the police force stretched to handmade suits. Agnes blushed slightly and looked away quickly when the chief inspector glanced over in her direction. She casually walked across to the window, but out of the corner of her eye, she could see that he was still watching her. Did he think she looked guilty? She really had to stop trying to analyze people. Jim always said it would get her into trouble one day, but she couldn't help herself. It was simply a habit she couldn't break. Agnes was staring out of the window at the bright colored lights on the quayside when the chief inspector spoke to her. "Excuse me," said the detective. Agnes caught her breath. She hadn't heard him approach. Rather surprising. She thought policemen were known for their big feet. Pushing the thought from her mind, she turned around to face him. "Yes," she said, giving a broad smile. "I'm sorry to bother you, but are you Agnes Harrison by any chance?" Agnes peered at the detective. It had been some years since anyone had called her by her maiden name. "No. Yes, no," she sighed and shook her head. Now she was beginning to sound like an idiot. "Can I start again?" The detective grinned. His brown eyes twinkled and he nodded for her to continue. "I was Agnes Harrison before I was married. I am Agnes Lockwood now." She peered at him. "Should I know you?" "My name is Alan Johnson. I think we were in the same class at school." Alan Johnson? Agnes repeated the name twice to herself before she made the connection. "Yes, I think I remember you. You were always talking about joining the Army. Or was it the Air Force?" "The Army," he confirmed. "Yes, that was me." "And did you join the Army, I mean?" "Yes, I did." Agnes gave a slight grin. That would account for his smart suit and polished shoes, she thought. "But now you are with the police force?" "Yes, long story." He hesitated. "Look, you will have gathered that I'm rather tied up at the moment," he said, glancing back at the commotion going on behind him. The quiet atmosphere of earlier had quickly changed into chaos as people realized that the search was really going to happen. "But would you care to meet up with me later for a drink in the bar? We could catch up with what has happened to us over the years. Ask your husband to join us," he added suddenly, noticing the wedding ring on her finger. "Thank you," Agnes replied. "That would be nice. However, I'm afraid it will just be me. My husband died a year ago." "I'm sorry to hear that. I'd best get back to the investigation," he added, changing the subject. "I'll meet you in the bar in about an hour or so." Agnes watched until he disappeared into the crowd by the reception desk. His sergeant looked relieved to see him return. The guests were becoming a little more agitated. The sergeant then glanced in her direction and frowned. He was probably wondering who she was. Or might he be thinking she was a suspect? She turned back to the window. It seemed she had a date. It would make a nice change having someone to sit with in the bar or the lounge. She had felt the odd one out since she had arrived at the hotel. It would be fun talking about all their old friends at school, and as Alan still lived in this area, it was possible he was still in touch with a few of them. If that was the case, she would ask him to make arrangements for a reunion. After all, that was the reason for her visit to Tyneside in the first place. She glanced at her watch. There was time for her to pop up to her room and freshen up. She almost skipped up the stairs and very nearly bumped into Angela. At the top, Angela was wearing her glum face and didn't even try to smile when Agnes apologized. But at that moment, Agnes couldn't care less. Tonight, at 55 years old, she had a date. Murder on Tyneside. Chapter 4. Alan was already in the bar when Agnes arrived. Though she had given him a little longer than an hour, she was rather surprised he had found the time to change from his suit into something a little less formal. Though she had to admit, he still looked very smart in his jacket and casual trousers. "I explained to my sergeant what I wanted him to do and left him to it," he said, as Agnes sat down. "Are you allowed to do that?" Agnes asked. "I mean, is he okay with you shooting off on a date at the beginning of an investigation?" According to Angela, her stolen necklace is worth a great deal of money. Allegedly stolen, there is a difference. Don't you believe her? Angela seems very sure it has been stolen. She thought back to the angry voices earlier that evening. Yet you think she might simply have mislaid it after all. Agnes leaned forward, rested her chin on the palm of her hand and screwed up her eyes. It was something she always did when she thought hard about a problem. Alan shrugged. "That's what we have to find out." Agnes's eyes widened. "So you think there may be another possibility?" He shrugged again and then smiled. "But we haven't met up after all these You're simply to talk about Mrs. Hargreaves' necklace. Yes, you're right. Saudi. Agnes sat back in her chair. She was slightly disappointed they weren't going to discuss the case any further. This was the first real-life investigation she had been caught up in. It was exciting. It was different. For goodness sake, it was so very different from the dull day-to-day life she now had to get used to. Okay, do you remember anyone else from way back yonder? And are you still in touch with any of them? Yes, and yes, quite a few of them actually. There was a get-together organized by a couple of old classmates just over a year ago, replied Alan. Slowly, but I gather from your tone, you are more interested in the case I'm working on than talking about the past. He raised his hand to catch the eye of passing waiter. Yes, I am, simply because I enjoy mysteries, Miss Marple and Hercule Poirot, that sort of thing. She broke off. Alan was staring at her. Did he think she had something to do with the missing necklace? Oh my goodness, you don't think I took the necklace, do you? Good heavens, no. Of course not. They both laughed, and Agnes noticed that, for an instant, the tired lines on his face disappeared. I was just a little surprised at your interest, he added. But I can't discuss an ongoing case with anyone, you should know that. Yes, you're right, of course. So how did the reunion go? Agnes asked, changing the subject. The waiter took their order and disappeared back to the bar. It went very well indeed, said Alan, catching up on their conversation. There were far more people than I thought there would be. Several had made the trip up from different parts of the country. It was just as well they had booked a fairly large venue. I would love to have been there, said Agnes, but I'm afraid I lost touch with everyone after we moved away. She paused, allowing her thoughts to travel back over the years. A few of us promised to write to each other, and we did for a while, she continued. But you know how it is. The waiter brought the drinks and Alan paid him, telling him to keep the change. Agnes was enjoying the evening so much, she didn't realize how late it was until the barman called for last orders. She was feeling rather sorry it was all about to end very soon. How long are you staying at the hotel? Alan asked. It's just I thought we might get together again before you have to rush off back to, where did you say you were living now? I don't think I said, Agnes laughed. Can you believe it? We have chatted about everything and everybody in our past, but I don't think we actually said much about ourselves, what either of us did after leaving school. Alan took a sip of his drink and set his glass down. He cocked his head to one side. I take that to mean you want me to go first. Agnes grinned. Okay, briefly, as I can see the guy behind the bar is getting agitated. I used to be a personal secretary with a large firm in London until we had the boys. After that I became a full-time mom. I did get a part-time job when they went to school and carried on working until a couple of years ago. Now I am a lady of leisure, living in Essex at the moment. My two sons live on the other side of the world, in Australia to be exact. You say you're living in Essex at the moment. Does that mean you are planning to move somewhere else? Perhaps even to Australia to join your sons? No, not Australia, said Agnes thoughtfully, though my boys asked me to join them out there after Jim died. They were worried about how I would cope on my own, but I decided against it. I told them that I didn't want them to feel they had to look out for me all the time. I wanted them to get on with their lives, just the way Jim and I did. But they wouldn't have always been looking out for you, ventured Alan. I mean, with you there, not far from where they were living, they would have been able to pop in to see you or vice versa. Yes, you're right, Agnes agreed, but not all the time. Like I said, they have their own lives to lead. There was a long pause before she continued. They need to do their own thing without them having to watch out for their mother all the time. Jim and I did our own thing. For a moment her eyes sparkled as she spoke of Jim. We both worked hard and we played hard. Together we saw the world. By now her face was flushed with excitement. We did the most wonderfully stupid things and we enjoyed every minute of it. Because, let's face it, you only get one crack at life. We wouldn't have listened to our parents. They knew that, so they never interfered. She looked down to the floor and sighed heavily. But that's not the reason you didn't go out there, is it? Alan spoke quietly. You wouldn't have interfered in their lives. You would have given them your blessing on whatever they wanted to do. Agnes looked up at him and blinked back, the tears welling in her eyes. No, she said. The truth is I was scared. I was scared of moving to a new country, and I was scared at having to make new friends. At last she was admitting, even to herself, why she hadn't gone out there to join them. All this time she had told everyone it was because she was worried she would be stopping the boys from getting on with their lives. That's the reason I didn't take up their offer. I was terrified of taking such a big step alone. If Jim had put forward the idea that we went out there to live, I would have gone with him without a second thought. He was my rock. But to go on my own, that is different. She looked Alan in the eye. Can you even begin to understand what I'm talking about? Suddenly feeling uncomfortable, she turned away. How could she have poured out her emotions to a relative stranger? She glanced towards the bar and held up her glass. She needed another drink. They called last orders 10 minutes ago, said Alan quietly. That doesn't apply to me. I'm staying here at the hotel. The bar is still open for residents. Do you want another drink, or will your wife be expecting you back? Murder on Tyneside. Chapter 5. Agnes awoke the next morning with a dreadful headache. She'd had far too much to drink the previous evening, but her outburst had left her feeling rather embarrassed, and the alcohol had helped hide her discomfort. Alan had been very kind. Changing the subject, he had told her a few things about himself. He had been married, but he and his wife were divorced. For some strange reason, once he and his fiancée had tied the knot, everything had gone wrong. Everything was perfect before the ceremony. We were so happy together, we both thought it was the real deal. Yet the moment we were married, everything changed. He had paused at that point as he thought back to the divorce. It was so strange, he said, picking up the story. Once we were back from our honeymoon, we couldn't agree on anything. He shrugged. I suppose some would say the magic was over. Alan had gone on to tell her that he had never thought about remarrying. Footloose and fancy-free, that's me. Yet there was something in his voice that told her he would give marriage another whirl if the right lady came along. Agnes showered and dressed before heading down to breakfast. Alan had said he would be calling at the hotel again to carry on with the inquiries. Perhaps she would bump into him and learn a little more about the case. She frowned. He wasn't really allowed to talk about ongoing inquiries, but surely it wouldn't hurt if she just happened to be around when he made some startling discovery. The dining room was almost empty when she walked in. Some of the guests would have checked out by now, while others probably wanted to get an early start on a full day of sightseeing. Agnes was still making her way across to her table when she noticed a young woman sitting alone at a table in a corner of the room. She was focused on something in the newspaper she was reading, but quite suddenly she folded the paper and stood up to leave. Agnes was a little intrigued as she watched the woman walk across the dining room. It was almost as though she had read something upsetting. But Agnes shrugged it off. Why did she have this thing about construing more into what people did? Perhaps the woman had simply finished breakfast and had decided to leave. Or maybe she suddenly realized the time and was late for an important appointment. She was very smartly dressed. Her skirt and blouse were perfectly matched. The woman didn't look in Agnes's direction as she made her way to the door. However, she did manage to give the waiter a thin smile as he rushed forward to clear her table. Agnes promptly forgot about the woman when she noticed a couple of policemen hanging around the reception area, though there wasn't any sign of the chief inspector. A waiter brought her the menu, and after glancing at it briefly, she decided to have the full English breakfast. To hell with the diet, she laughed as the waiter wrote it down. He told her she didn't need to diet as he headed off towards the kitchen. It was true. She had never had a weight problem. Most of her friends had always envied her slim figure. She had almost finished breakfast when she saw Alan passing the entrance of the dining room. When he saw her, he gave some instructions to his sergeant before strolling in to join her. The sergeant nodded and made his way over to the lift. Good morning, Alan. Do sit down and have some coffee. She gestured to the chair opposite her before attracting the waiter's attention, making signs that she needed another cup. Are you any further forward in finding the missing necklace? No, I'm afraid not, he said as he sat down. He paused as the waiter placed a cup and saucer in front of him. The rooms we have checked so far have all been cleared, he continued. He looked down at a piece of toast in the toast rack. Is that going spare? I missed breakfast this morning. Yes, help yourself. I have had more than enough to eat. She leaned forward as she poured some coffee into Alan's cup. I saw the lovely Angela this morning. She seemed rather subdued. Certainly nothing like the woman we heard ranting yesterday. Her husband was with her. He looked even more fed up than ever. Alan turned and looked around to make sure no one could hear him. Well, she doesn't need to rant about it anymore. It seems she has friends in high places. What do you mean? Asked Agnes. She's got the chief constable involved. He's asked me to do everything necessary to find the necklace as quickly as possible. Alan gave the hint of a smile. I suppose he wants her off his back, and I can't say I blame him. Before Agnes could reply, Alan's sergeant hurried into the room. You had better come upstairs. There's been another robbery. He looked rather agitated. It's a bracelet this time, and he broke off and shook his head. And the chief inspector prompted. It belongs to someone in the room next door to Mr. and Mrs. Hargreaves. No, I can't believe it. Alan turned to Agnes and made his apologies before hurrying out of the dining room and over towards the lift. Don't forget you promised you would check my room this morning, she called out after him. I don't want to be stuck in the hotel all day. But she wasn't. Sure, he heard her. Agnes sat back in her chair and pushed her cup and saucer away from her. Why did all this have to happen while she was staying here? All the guests, including her, would have their rooms checked all over again. Peering through to the reception, Agnes could see the manager of the hotel, trying desperately to pacify his irate guests. She had to agree, it certainly wasn't good for the hotel. She wandered idly from the dining room into the drawing room. She was just about to sit down when the detective sergeant burst into the room. The chief inspector wanted you to know that your room has been searched, and you are free to leave the hotel. He coughed and looked towards the bag she was clutching. Once I search your handbag. Yes, of course. She thrust the bag towards him. Help yourself. She watched him empty the contents of her bag onto the coffee table. This was the first time she had actually seen the sergeant properly. Other times he had been on the other side of the room. He looked quite young to be a sergeant, but then she found it difficult to judge the age of young people these days. Like his boss, the sergeant was clean-shaven and was wearing a suit, though it didn't look as well-made as Alan's. This one was more off the peg. Everything seems to be in order, he said, handing the bag back to her. Enjoy your day. Thank you. She was about to ask him about the latest missing necklace, but he rushed back out into the reception area before she got the chance. Later, outside the hotel, she made her way to the taxi rank. She had decided to take a trip up to the shopping center and treat herself to something new. Not that she needed anything. Her wardrobes back home were all full to bursting point. But Agnes could never resist the urge to shop. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The shopping trip was a success. There were so many shops to explore she couldn't get around them all in one day. Another trip into the city center was definitely a must before she returned to her home in Essex. But that didn't stop her from buying 2 new dresses and a pair of shoes on this visit. Carrying 2 bags of new skirts, dresses, or whatever else had caught her eye, she was heading towards the taxi rank when she caught sight of Angela and her husband. Angela was pointing towards a jeweler's. However, from what Agnes could see, George didn't appear to be very keen. He opened his mouth to say something, but Angela didn't wait to hear. She simply flounced off into the shop, leaving him standing there on the pavement. For a moment he didn't seem to know what to do. He stood there with his hands in his pockets and looked around at the other shoppers, all going about their business. But then he suddenly caught a glimpse of Agnes watching him. She gave him a smile of encouragement, but it seemed to make matters worse. Looking embarrassed, George turned and hurried after his wife. Agnes sighed as she continued towards the taxi rank. Per George, she thought. Nothing the poor man did seemed to be right. Back at the hotel, she paid the taxi fare and walked up the steps into the hotel. She loved this hotel. The views were brilliant and it had up-to-the-minute facilities. Yet she still couldn't help thinking it stood out from the rest of the buildings along the quayside. Not because it was impressive, which it was, but because it looked too new and didn't fit in with some of the other buildings. Perhaps it would have blended in better if the architect had designed the outside to look a little more like the older buildings along the quayside. Though, on the other hand, it didn't look so out of character as the new law court building further along the quay. She sniffed as she stepped into the lift. That was only her opinion. It was obvious by the number of people staying here that the hotel was appreciated by lots of people. Agnes only had time to remove her coat before she heard a tap on her door. Believing it to be one of the staff, she hurried across to open it and was rather surprised to see Alan standing there. "Is there a problem?" she asked. She glanced up and down the hall expecting to see his sergeant. But he was alone. "I was just passing and I wondered whether you might like to have dinner with me this evening." He grinned. "Actually, I am still here looking into the case of the missing necklace. Or I should say the case of the missing necklace and bracelet." "Gomain, Agnes grinned. How did you know which was my room?" she asked as she closed the door. "I'm a detective, remember?" he replied, tapping his nose. "Anyway, would you like to join me for dinner? There's a nice little restaurant further along the way you might enjoy." "Thank you, Alan. That's very kind of you." "Not at all. We can continue the conversation about old times without the thought of any interruptions from my sergeant regarding the ongoing case." "How is it going?" Agnes inquired. "Are you any further forward in recovering the jewelry?" "No, unfortunately not. They both seem to have disappeared without trace." "Cheer up, Alan. I'm sure everything will work out in the end." Agnes wasn't really sure about that. If the necklace and bracelet had been stolen and not simply mislaid, they could be in some backstreet second-hand jeweler shop in another town by now. "I'll pick you up at about 7, if that's all right with you," said Alan, starting to walk back towards the door. "Lovely. I'll look forward to it." She walked across to where her afternoon shopping lay unopened. Perhaps she would wear one of her new dresses this evening. Murder on Tyneside. Chapter 6. The rest of the afternoon seemed to pass rather quickly. Agnes had decided to pop out to the nearby cafe for coffee rather than sit in her room. She enjoyed watching people coming and going. It was certainly better than being alone. Upstairs, after finishing her coffee, she had taken a short stroll along the quayside. On her way back to the hotel, she saw someone leaning out of one of the hotel windows. For a moment, she thought the person was waving to someone across the river, but glancing over to the other side of the Tyne, she couldn't see anyone responding. A few moments later, the person disappeared back inside the room. She turned away. The person had probably been admiring the view. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Now, showered and dressed, Agnes pondered on whether to go downstairs to wait for Alan. But in the end, she decided to wait in her room. Perhaps she would look too keen if she was almost standing at the hotel entrance waiting for him to appear. There was a tap on the door. Alan was standing there when she opened it. "All set?" he asked. "I just need to get my bag, and I'll be right with you," she replied. It was beginning to rain when they emerged from the hotel. However, Alan had a taxi waiting at the entrance, and a short while later they pulled up outside the restaurant. By now the rain was falling heavily, so they hurried inside. The restaurant was rather full. It seemed it was popular with the locals. A waiter led them to their table and asked if they would like to order drinks. While they chose from the extensive menu, Agnes took a few moments to look at their surroundings. She found the atmosphere to be warm and comfortable. Quite cozy, really. The walls were covered with photographs. Some showed the quayside from the past to the present, while others displayed various areas of the city center. Above the bar area hung models of the large ships which had visited the Tyne in the past, and in one corner of the restaurant stood a large dresser filled with local memorabilia. Looking at the various items, Agnes's memories were stirred as she recalled seeing similar things in her grandmother's house. She had been very young, so her grandma had only allowed her to look at the precious treasures through the glass doors of the cabinet in her front room. "When you are older, I will let you hold them." But it never happened. Her grandmother died shortly after they had moved abroad. Until now, she had forgotten all about the ornaments in the old house. Though, thinking about it now, she wondered what had happened to them. She glanced back at the dresser. Perhaps some of them had ended up here. How proud her grandma would be if she knew her possessions were still on show. The evening passed very quickly. Agnes was interested to know what Alan had done since he left school, and he was happy to tell her. He had enjoyed his days as a soldier, but once he finished his service, he had headed straight back to Tyneside. "I really missed the place," he told her. "It was good to be home, though it had changed a great deal during the time I was away, and it's been changing ever since." He went on to tell her about his work as a policeman and how he had climbed the ladder to the rank of Detective Chief Inspector. "Now then, what about you?" he asked. "What did you do after you left the country?" Agnes told him about her life abroad with her parents. "I found it daunting," going to a new school and making new friends. It was even more difficult as I couldn't speak their language, but they were all so kind and helped me. Some of them even tried to learn English from me. She laughed. Can you imagine it? They were teaching me French while they were trying to learn English. I must say we had some fun over that. She paused. After a few years, my parents came back to England and settled in London. You never thought of visiting the north? He inquired. You know, just for old-time sake. No, Agnes said. There never seemed to be time. But looking back, I wish I had made time to bring Jim up here. He would have loved it. She paused for a moment, but then continued. But that's life, isn't it? You do everything you can. Yet there is still always something you wish you had done and then find it is too late. It was quite late when they left the restaurant. The rain had stopped and the dark clouds had rolled away, making way for the full moon to shine down onto the quayside. Shall we walk back to the hotel? Agnes suggested. It's rather pleasant. Now, in the distance she could see the colored lights glowing from the Millennium Bridge. I did so want to see the lights, but I was a little anxious about coming out on my own after dark. Alan agreed. They were just about to set off when they heard a loud thud. It came from somewhere on the opposite side of the street. At first they couldn't see anything, but crossing the road, they were able to make out something lying on edge of the pavement. You wait here, I'll see what it is, said Alan. Not on your life, Agnes replied and began to hurry towards the object. Alan caught up with her and they arrived together to find a woman lying at their feet. Her body was stretched across the edge of the pavement and onto the road. At first they thought the woman might be drunk and had fallen over. However, when Alan leant over the woman to take a closer look, he saw there was no sign of any movement. He felt for a pulse, but there was none. Agnes gasped and took a step backwards when he looked up at her and shook his head. She glanced up and down the street, half expecting to see someone lurking somewhere in the shadows, but there was no one to be seen. It was at that moment she heard something and looked up in time to see a window closing somewhere above her head. Alan, she said, pointing upwards. Someone has just closed a window up there. By now, he was on his phone calling for backup. Do you think she could have been pushed from up there? Agnes asked. When he had finished his call, she could well have been, but she was shot first. Alan pointed down towards the woman. Agnes stepped a little closer and looked down at the body. She was horrified to see the woman's legs twisted under her. One of her arms was stretched out to one side, while the other was lying across her chest. But what really sent her reeling was the sight of blood surrounding a hole in the woman's forehead. When she had first looked down at the body, the woman's hair had been covering half of her face. Alan must have brushed it aside while checking to see whether she was drunk and had simply fallen over. Agnes clasped her hand over her mouth and quickly looked away. But there was something familiar about what the woman was wearing, and after a moment's thought, she turned back and looked again. She swallowed hard and forced herself to look at the woman's face for a second time. I've seen her before, she uttered, swiftly turning away again. She's staying at the hotel? I saw her this morning in the dining room. She didn't speak to me. I don't think she even noticed I was there. She had finished breakfast and was poring over her newspaper. Well, that's a start, said Alan. We'll make some inquiries at the hotel. They should have her home phone number at the very least. He stood up. I better get you back to the hotel. Once my officers arrive, I'll ask someone to take you back. Agnes pulled a face. No, I would like to stay. Besides, aren't I a witness or something? Well, yes, technically, he sounded doubtful, but you didn't see any more than I did. We arrived on the scene together, remember? Ah, yes, but it was me who saw the window close, remember? Agnes had no intention of being shunted off in some police car, not when there was a possible murder inquiry on the cards. You wouldn't have known about that if I hadn't told you. Also, she added before Alan could get a word in, it was me who recognized the victim as someone staying at the hotel. Alan held up his hands. Okay, but before he could say any more, a police car swung around the corner, followed by a van carrying the pathologist. Murder on Tyneside. Chapter 7. The police officers spoke to the chief inspector, leaving the pathologist to see to the body. Alan quickly filled them in with what he knew, though it was precious little. And who is this? One of them asked, pointing towards Agnes. "This is Mrs. Lockwood," replied Alan. "We discovered the body together. While I was bending over the body, she saw a window close up above." He pointed upwards. "Did you see which window it was?" The police officer was now addressing Agnes. "Yes, it was that one on the first floor." She pointed towards the window she meant. "There, just above that plaque on the wall." She placed her hand in front of her mouth and looked at Alan. "Oh my goodness, this is Bessie Surtees' house." She paused, and the window I saw being pulled shut was the one Bessie climbed out of all those years ago when she eloped with her young man. The name of Bessie Surtees was well known on Tyneside. However, the story of the plucky young woman who edged her way through the tiny window to run off with a man called John Scott was now known worldwide. Her father disapproved of his daughter marrying the penniless young man and had forbidden her to see him, but Bessie disobeyed her father and, despite wearing a crinoline dress, she managed to squeeze through the window and run off with her young man. There was a happy ending to the story as John proved his worth by becoming one the Earl of Eldon and Chancellor of England. But that room is a museum now. The officer took off his hat and scratched his head. Why would anyone be in there at this time of night? "I don't know," said Agnes. "But that is the window I saw being closed after we found the body." "Did you see the face of the person closing the window?" asked the officer. He held his pen over his notebook ready to take down any useful notes. "No," said Agnes thoughtfully. "The window was almost closed when I looked up. I wasn't able to see anyone's face." "I see," said the officer, lowering the notebook. "Not much to go on, is it?" Agnes picked up the note of sarcasm in his voice. "I suppose not. But on the other hand, you wouldn't have known anyone was up there and that there is the possibility the woman was shot inside the house and thrown out of the window," she retorted. "You would have simply assumed she was shot right here on the spot where she lies and begun your investigation in the wrong place." "The lady is right," said Alan. He had been about to intervene when the officer made his curt remark, but Agnes had beaten him to it. "Therefore we now know we need to begin our investigation by checking out this old house." He paused. "I suggest you get on with it, Constable." "Yes, sir." The officer gave Agnes a sweeping glance before striding across to the door and tugging on the handle. "It's locked," he said with a shrug. Alan stared at him. "Of course it's locked. This is a museum. You need to find out who has the keys and get that person here tonight. Then you will have to check out all the other key holders. Find out where they were this evening. Do I really need to spell it out for you?" He paused. "And you," he said, looking towards the other officer, "take a look around the back. See if any of the windows are open or broken. Meanwhile, I'm going to commandeer your car and take Mrs. Lockwood back to her hotel. I will return in a few minutes." "Right, sir." The officer glanced at Agnes and mumbled something under his breath before pulling out his phone. The other officer had already disappeared to check out the rear of the building. "I heard that," Agnes said as she strode past him towards the police car. "Sorry, ma'am," he said. He looked towards the senior officer hoping he hadn't heard. Alan continued to walk to the car without as much as a glance at him. It seemed he hadn't picked up his tetchy remark. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Alan pulled up at the hotel to find another police car parked outside. Looking further up the road, he was surprised to see his sergeant's car. "Now, what?" he mumbled under his breath as he opened the car door and stepped out onto the pavement. Agnes didn't wait for Alan to come around to open the passenger door. She quickly heaved the door open and clambered out. This evening was becoming more thrilling as the hours passed by. "Gosh," she uttered excitedly. "I wonder what has been going on here." "I think we are about to find out," Alan hissed as he saw his sergeant waiting for him at the entrance to the hotel. "There's been another theft. I put in a call for you, but I got a routed message saying you were on your way." He paused when he suddenly saw Agnes hurrying around from the other side of the car. "Good evening, Mrs. Lockwood. I'm sure you don't want to be caught up in another robbery. You must be very tired." "No, I'm fine," she replied. "I think I need a drink." "What about you?" she added, looking at Alan, hinting that there was no way she was going to go anywhere without hearing all the details. Alan shook his head. "Nothing for me," he said. "But, yes, you go ahead." He knew there was no way Agnes was going to disappear upstairs like a good little girl. "You say there's been another robbery here at the hotel?" he added, turning back to Sergeant Andrews. Yes, sir. The woman is dreadfully upset. He paused for a moment. The manager is in his office. He's in a bit of a state about all this. I'm sure he is, and what I have to tell him isn't going to help. Why? What's happened? Andrews asked. One of the guests has been murdered. Mrs. Lockwood and I discovered the body about half an hour ago. Mrs. Lockwood recognized her as a guest at the hotel. Murdered? How? Where? We found the body outside Bessie Surtees's house. She had been shot in the head. We assumed she had been thrown out of a window. Mrs. Lockwood saw someone closing the window while I was examining the body. I left a couple of officers at the scene. I said I would only be a few minutes. Please call me Agnes. Mrs. Lockwood sounds so formal. Alan turned around in surprise. I thought you had gone for a drink. I did. I have it here. Agnes held up her glass. Have I missed anything? Alan shook his head. No, I was just telling Sergeant Andrews about the murder. He turned back to his sergeant. I think I better have a word with the manager. Is he in his office? Andrews nodded. Okay, I'll just be a few minutes, and then you can bring me up to speed on the robbery before I go back to the murder scene. Alan called out as he strode off through the reception. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Back at Bessie Surtees's house, the chief inspector found more officers had arrived and the area had been cordoned off. Dr. Nichols, the pathologist, and his assistant loaded the body into the van. At this point, he was unable to tell Alan any more than he already knew. The woman had been shot within the last 3 hours. The bruises to her head had occurred after death. He explained that any further information would only be found once he had carried out a post-mortem. At that moment, a man, escorted by a police officer, headed towards them. He was brandishing the key to the museum and didn't look too happy at being dragged from his bed at such an unearthly hour. This is Mr. Donaldson, said the officer. He is the museum curator. Mr. Donaldson glanced briefly at the pathologist still dressed in white coveralls before turning his attention to the chief inspector. Your officer told me that you believe the victim was killed in the museum and the body was pushed through a window. Alan nodded. Yes, that one. He pointed to the window Agnes had seen being closed. He held his hand out for the key. That's impossible. No one can get into the building without a key, the curator mumbled. He dropped the key into Alan's hand. Well, it appears someone managed to do it, replied the chief inspector. He handed the key to one of the police officers and nodded towards the door. Unless, of course, one of the keys was stolen, or he broke off and peered at the curator. Or, Mr. Donaldson prompted. Or one of the key holders is responsible, Alan continued. We need a list of everyone who carries a key to the building. Isn't it possible someone could have gotten through a window at the back of the house where they wouldn't be seen? Now there's a thought. Alan folded his arms. Why didn't we think of that? So, are you saying the windows at the back of the building are usually left unlocked? No, of course not. I simply meant that it might have been forced or even broken, Mr. Donaldson snapped. Do you think we didn't check the back of the house while we were waiting for you to turn up? None of the windows appear to have been forced or broken. Alan was trying to stay calm, but this man was beginning to grate on his nerves. We'll take a better look once we are inside. While they had been talking, 2 police officers, followed by 2 forensic experts, had gone inside to check out the building. One of the officers now arrived back at the front door and told the chief inspector that there was no one inside. Whoever did this has gone, he said, gesturing towards where the body had been found. Officers are checking for any evidence the perpetrators might have left behind. My colleague is making sure the windows haven't been tampered with. He paused and looked at the curator. But this is starting to look like an inside job. The chief inspector nodded. It was certainly beginning to look that way. Or else, they were dealing with one very clever individual. The pathologist had gone through the dead woman's pockets before the body was moved, hoping to find something the chief inspector could work on. But there was nothing, not even a driving license. Someone had removed all forms of identification before throwing the body from the window. Alan had taken a photograph of the woman's face earlier. He had shown it to the manager of the hotel when he had taken Agnes back. However, without a room number, the manager couldn't name her. Yet he felt sure his reception staff would recognize her once they saw the photo. They deal with the guests on a one-to-one basis every day, he'd said. Alan had already forwarded the photo to his sergeant's phone, instructing him to show it to all the night staff. If no one recognized her, he was to have a copy printed off ready for the day staff coming on duty. For goodness sake, someone must know who the woman was. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Back at the hotel, Agnes was far from sleepy. Once DCI Johnson went back to the murder scene, Sergeant Andrews tried again to persuade her to retire for the night. Why not go upstairs to your room? There is nothing you can do here. Are you kidding me? No way. Agnes thought. I am a witness to the murder. Well, a witness to seeing a window close after the body was found, she told him. What if Alan comes back and needs to speak to me? Anyway, what's all this about another robbery? I mean, that's why you are here, isn't it? Yes, it is, Andrews replied. But I can't discuss the case with you. Agnes eyed him as she took another sip of her wine. Was it Mrs. Hargreaves? Again? No, it was. The sergeant stopped mid-sentence and frowned. You know, I can't tell you who it was. Well, shouldn't you be up there now questioning the woman about her missing jewelry? She paused, asking all those questions about when she last saw it. I have already tried to speak to. He stopped short and frowned at her. Look, I'm sorry, but I must go back upstairs. I left a constable with her until she calmed down a little. Andrews started walking towards the door. She was quite upset about the robbery. Is the constable a man or a woman? Agnes asked, catching up with him. It's a man. The sergeant stopped and looked at her. I didn't have any women constables with me. Then perhaps I could be of help, Agnes insisted. I mean, as a woman, I could comfort her while you asked the necessary questions. Andrews looked at her. Perhaps she was right. When he had tried to question the woman earlier, she had been too distraught. It seemed the missing item was the last gift her husband had given her before he died. Okay, he said after a long pause. But if she is unhappy at you being in the room, you must leave immediately. He sighed. This wasn't supposed to be how it was done, but there seemed to be no alternative. Understood, Agnes nodded. She placed her glass on a nearby table and followed the sergeant across the reception area.